Napoleon Bonaparte was not born into greatness. In fact, his story began on a small Mediterranean island called Corsica, which had only recently become a part of France. He was born on August 15, 1769, in the city of Ajaccio, into a modest family of minor Italian nobility. Though his family was respected, they were far from wealthy. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer, and his mother, Letizia Ramolino, was known for her strong discipline and deep Catholic faith. From an early age, Napoleon showed signs of brilliance, but also stubbornness. He had a sharp mind and was incredibly focused for someone so young. When he was just 9 years old, he left Corsica for mainland France to pursue a military education. This was not an easy experience. He barely spoke French at the time, his native language was Corsican, and his strong accent made him stand out. In the elite French schools, he was often teased for his background and his poverty. Yet, young Napoleon did not let these early challenges break him. Instead, they hardened his resolve. He poured himself into his studies, excelling in mathematics, history, and, most importantly, military strategy. He spent hours reading about the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, two historical figures he would one day be compared to. At 15, he was admitted to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, the Royal Military School. He trained to become an artillery officer, one of the most technical roles in the French army. By age 16, he became a second lieutenant. It was a remarkable achievement, especially considering his young age and outsider status. During this time, France was going through enormous changes. The French Revolution had begun, challenging the old monarchy and turning the country into a republic. It was a time of chaos, but also a time of opportunity for someone like Napoleon, someone bold, intelligent, and ambitious. While other officers from noble families fled the country or lost their titles, Napoleon stayed. He saw in the revolution a chance to rise, not because of his family name, but because of his talent. His loyalty to the revolutionary ideals and his skill in battle would soon set him apart. One of his first big opportunities came during the siege of Toulon in 1793. The city had rebelled against the Republic and was being aided by the British Navy. Napoleon, still a young officer, proposed a bold artillery strategy to recapture the city. His plan worked, and suddenly, people began to notice him. He was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. This was only the beginning. From a boy mocked for his accent and origin, Napoleon had risen to become one of France's youngest and most promising military leaders. His rise from obscurity to fame was fast, and his ambition was limitless. As we move into the next chapter of his life, we'll see how this once shy Corsican boy became the most powerful man in Europe. But for now, remember this: greatness often begins in unlikely places, and the fire that burns brightest sometimes starts from a small spark. Napoleon Bonaparte's military journey took a dramatic turn in 1796, when, at just 26 years old, he was given command of the French army in Italy. At that time, France was struggling economically, and its army was poorly fed, poorly clothed, and deeply demoralized. But Napoleon had something that the army desperately needed: confidence, boldness, and brilliant strategy. Almost overnight, he transformed the disorganized French troops into a powerful and disciplined force. His campaigns in Italy are still studied in military academies around the world today. Using rapid movements and surprise tactics, Napoleon outmaneuvered the Austrian forces who had long dominated the Italian peninsula. In battle after battle, Montenotte, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli, he led his troops to stunning victories. What made him different was not just his clever military strategies, but his ability to inspire his soldiers. He was known for delivering rousing speeches and marching alongside his men through mud, rain, and hunger. His men adored him. To them, he wasn't just a general, he was a leader who truly cared for their fate. During this campaign, Napoleon also demonstrated his political skill. He negotiated treaties, reorganized territories, and even created new republics under French influence. These early victories didn't just bring glory to France, they brought glory to Napoleon himself. Newspapers across Europe began to publish his name. In France, he was becoming a national hero. People were beginning to whisper that this young general might not just be a servant of the revolution, he could be its master. In 1798, eager to challenge British power and cut off their trade route to India, Napoleon proposed a bold new idea, an expedition to Egypt. He convinced the French government to back him, and once again, he set off, this time with a large fleet and thousands of troops. His goal was both military and scientific. Along with his army, he brought over 100 scholars, scientists, and artists to study the ancient culture of Egypt. It was during this expedition that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, which later helped scholars decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. However, Napoleon's Egyptian campaign was not as successful as the Italian one. Though he defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids and entered Cairo in triumph, his fleet was soon destroyed by the British Navy at the Battle of the Nile. Admiral Horatio Nelson's victory meant Napoleon and his men were stranded in Egypt. Despite being isolated, he tried to maintain control, governing Egypt and even leading a failed expedition into Syria. Conditions grew difficult. Supplies were low. Disease spread. And back in France, political turmoil was growing again. Napoleon realized that if he wanted to keep his rising status and influence, he had to return. In 1799, abandoning much of his army, he secretly sailed back to France. Surprisingly, instead of being punished, he was welcomed as a hero. Why? Because while he had been away, the French government, the Directory, had grown weak and unpopular. People were looking for strength. They were looking for order. And Napoleon, with his record of victories and strong leadership, seemed like the perfect answer. So, the young Corsican who had once been mocked for his accent and humble origins had now become one of the most powerful men in France. He was no longer just a general. He was on the path to becoming a ruler. But his story was only just beginning. After securing his dominance in France, Napoleon Bonaparte didn't stop. In fact, this was just the beginning. Having already earned the admiration of the people and the trust of the army, Napoleon knew he had the tools to build something greater, an empire. In 1804, with France now stable and thriving under his leadership, Napoleon made a bold move. He declared himself Emperor of the French. At the grand ceremony held at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, he crowned himself, literally. Normally, a pope would crown the emperor, but Napoleon took the crown and placed it on his own head. This act sent a powerful message: he owed his power to no one but himself. The crowd cheered. The age of the French Empire had begun. With his new title, Napoleon began expanding French influence across Europe. He launched military campaigns that historians now refer to as the Napoleonic Wars. His armies moved swiftly, defeating old monarchies and redrawing the map of Europe. From Italy to Prussia, from Austria to Spain, Napoleon's shadow stretched far and wide. His military genius was unmatched. He used clever tactics, unexpected movements, and speed to outsmart his enemies. In battle after battle, he was victorious. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, all became symbols of French power. But Napoleon wasn't just a warrior. He was a visionary leader. He brought reforms to every land he conquered. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, a system of laws that emphasized equality before the law, freedom of religion, and protection of property. Even today, many countries base parts of their legal systems on his code. He also improved education, built roads, supported science, and promoted a sense of order and progress. Back in France, life was changing. Napoleon's rule brought stability. Farmers farmed, factories produced goods, and people had work. There was order after the chaos of the revolution. The people admired him. He was seen as a man of action, of strength, of destiny. However, not everyone in Europe admired Napoleon. Monarchs saw him as a threat to their power. They formed alliances against him. Still, Napoleon was always ready. He defeated coalition after coalition. At his height, Napoleon controlled most of continental Europe either through direct rule or through allied kingdoms. He put his family members on thrones. His brother became king of Spain, another became king of Naples. It seemed as if nothing could stop him. But with every victory, Napoleon's ambitions grew. And with ambition came danger. By reshaping Europe and challenging old traditions, he made many enemies. Some believed he was a liberator, others saw him as a dictator in disguise. Still, for nearly a decade, Napoleon ruled the European stage like a superstar. His name inspired fear, admiration, and hope. He changed the lives of millions. France was at the center of world affairs, and its emperor stood tall above all others. But every empire has its limits. And Napoleon's greatest challenge was just ahead. At the height of his power, Napoleon was unstoppable. He had defeated every major power in Europe, Austria, Prussia, Spain, and even humbled the mighty Holy Roman Empire. But one challenge still loomed large: Russia. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia had once been allies. They signed a peace treaty at Tilsit in 1807. But over time, things changed. Russia grew tired of Napoleon's control over European trade, especially his continental system. A blockade meant to weaken Britain by cutting off its trade with the rest of Europe. Russia, whose economy relied on British goods, began to ignore the blockade. Napoleon saw this as betrayal. In 1812, Napoleon decided to act. He gathered one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men from across the continent, and marched east to force Russia back into line. It would become one of the most tragic and defining campaigns in history. At first, Napoleon expected a quick victory. He thought he could defeat the Russian army in a matter of weeks and force a peace treaty. But the Russians had other plans. Instead of facing Napoleon in large battles, they retreated deeper and deeper into their country, burning everything as they went: homes, crops, supplies. This brutal strategy, known as scorched earth, left Napoleon's grand army with little food and nowhere to rest. Still, Napoleon pushed forward. By September, he reached Moscow, hoping to force the Russians to surrender. But when he arrived, the city was nearly abandoned, and soon after, it was set on fire. The flames destroyed most of Moscow. There would be no victory celebration. There was no Russian surrender. Winter was coming, and Napoleon was stuck in a burned-out, frozen city. The retreat from Moscow would become one of the most disastrous military decisions in history. The Grand Army, already starving and exhausted, now had to march back west through the brutal Russian winter. Temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze to death. Horses collapsed. Roads were covered in snow and ice. And as the French army tried to escape, Russian forces harassed them constantly, picking them off one by one. Disease, starvation, and cold claimed more lives than bullets ever did. By the time what was left of the army staggered out of Russia, only around 100,000 men remained. Napoleon had lost over 500,000 soldiers, a loss so massive, it shocked all of Europe. The Russian campaign shattered Napoleon's image as an unbeatable genius. His enemies sensed weakness. Across Europe, old rivals formed new alliances. Countries that had once been defeated began to rise again. Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia all joined together. Napoleon's dream of total control was slipping through his fingers. But even now, he didn't give up. He returned to France, raised new armies, and prepared to fight again. But the tide had turned. After the disaster in Russia, Napoleon's world began to fall apart. His enemies saw their chance and quickly united against him. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, once defeated or silenced, now joined forces in a powerful coalition. They knew he was weaker than before, and they weren't going to let this opportunity slip away. Back in France, Napoleon was not the same. His once massive army had been reduced to a shadow. To defend his empire, he had to recruit new, inexperienced soldiers, young boys, old men, anyone who could hold a weapon. Despite these challenges, he still managed to win several impressive battles. His genius on the battlefield hadn't disappeared. In 1813, he fought the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations. It was one of the largest battles in European history at the time. More than 600,000 soldiers were involved. Napoleon fought with all his strength. But the coalition was too strong, too determined. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and eventually, defeated. After Leipzig, it became clear, France couldn't hold the empire together any longer. One by one, Napoleon's allies abandoned him. His enemies pushed forward, heading straight for Paris. In 1814, Paris was captured. The unthinkable had happened. Napoleon, the man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French, was forced to abdicate, to give up the throne. Europe's most powerful man had fallen. He was exiled to a small Mediterranean island called Elba. It seemed like the story was over. But this is Napoleon we're talking about. He wasn't done yet. Less than a year later, in 1815, he escaped from Elba. With a handful of followers, he sailed back to France. Many expected him to be captured or killed. But something extraordinary happened. As he marched through France, soldiers sent to stop him joined him instead. They remembered his greatness, his victories, his promise of glory. The people shouted, "Vive l'Empereur," as he walked into Paris once more. The king who had taken his place fled. Napoleon was back. What followed was known as the 100 Days, a short but intense return to power. Europe was shocked. The coalition immediately regrouped, determined to end this once and for all. They prepared their armies. Napoleon moved fast. He knew time wasn't on his side, so he tried to strike before his enemies could fully unite. That led to the most famous battle of his life, and the one that would end it all. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced the British army led by the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians under General Blucher. He believed he could win. He had won tougher battles before. But this time, things were different. The ground was muddy from rain, slowing down his troops. His strategies didn't work like they used to. And the Prussian reinforcements arrived just in time to tip the balance. After a long, brutal fight, Napoleon was finally defeated. This time, there was no escape. He was captured and exiled again, but not to Elba. The Allies chose a much more remote location, St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic Ocean, far from Europe. There, surrounded by the endless sea, Napoleon spent the last years of his life in isolation. No armies. No battles. No empire. Just memories of what he once was. But even in defeat, Napoleon's legacy would live on. Napoleon's legacy is as vast and complex as the empire he once ruled. Even after his final defeat, his influence didn't fade, it evolved, becoming deeply rooted in European culture, law, politics, and military strategy. After the crushing loss at Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, far from the European continent he had once dominated. Life on the island was a dramatic contrast to the glory of his earlier years. Confined, watched, and surrounded by only a handful of loyal followers, Napoleon spent his remaining years reflecting on his life, writing his memoirs, and dictating his version of history. Yet, he remained defiant in spirit. He defended his reforms and leadership decisions, portraying himself not just as a fallen emperor, but as a misunderstood visionary who aimed to modernize Europe and spread revolutionary ideals. Meanwhile, back in France and across Europe, the Napoleonic Code, his civil law system, remained one of his most enduring contributions. It influenced not only French law but also legal systems in countries like Italy, Germany, and even parts of Latin America. The code emphasized equality before the law, protection of property rights, and a secular state, principles that still shape modern democracies. Napoleon's military tactics continued to be studied in military academies worldwide, admired for their brilliance, innovation, and boldness. Despite his authoritarian tendencies and the massive loss of life during his wars, many remembered him as a figure who challenged the old order and reshaped a continent. Napoleon died in 1821, likely of stomach cancer, though conspiracy theories about poisoning persist to this day. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of his story. In 1840, his remains were returned to France and buried in a grand tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, a gesture that symbolized national reconciliation and the enduring fascination with his life. To some, Napoleon was a tyrant, to others, a hero. But no matter the view, he remains one of the most iconic and studied figures in world history, a man who rose from obscurity to command empires, only to fall, and yet never be forgotten.